Hey guys, Morgan the Rebellious Reviewer. We talk about music and occasionally books and movies. And today I'm going to be counting down 10 albums that I feel fit Gemini. I love music and I love astrology, so I figured why not make a series combining the two. Yes, you heard that right. This will be a series, meaning that yes, I will be doing the other zodiac signs. Before we get started, let's get some rules out of the way. 1. These videos will be released at the start of every zodiac sign. So don't get impatient waiting for your sign because I'll get to it eventually. 2. These albums are in no particular order. 3. These albums aren't necessarily albums that I think all Geminis will like. They're just albums that I feel fit Gemini's personality traits. Remember, your music taste is not determined by your zodiac sign, so don't take it too seriously. A link to the article I got the traits we'll be discussing today from will be linked in the description down below. And with that, let's get started with an album that fits Gemini's symbol, the Twins. And that album is Sing-Along Songs for the Damned and Delirious by Diablo Swing Orchestra. So, I actually discovered these guys while doing research for this video. To me, the Twins represents a dual personality, and I wanted an album that would reflect that either musically or lyrically. I couldn't think of that many albums about dual personalities lyrically, so I decided to go with an album that had more than one identity musically. Diablo Swing Orchestra definitely fits that description. These guys are basically what would happen if symphonic metal added swing elements. Choosing to combine metal with swing was a unique decision for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that metal is known for being scary and dark, while swing is known for being upbeat and fun. Combining the two genres makes the album feel like it has a light side and a dark side. On one hand, the swing elements make the album seem really bouncy and fun, but on the other hand, if you dig in even a little bit into the lyrics, you'll find that they're just as dark as any other metal band. Basically, the overall feel of this album reminds me of a Gemini experiencing an existential crisis, depression, or any other form of extreme stress. It may seem upbeat and fun, but the darkness is lurking just beneath the surface. It reminds me of how a Gemini named Anne Frank described herself in her diary, full of darkness and pain, but knowing how to hide it, at least to some extent. Even ignoring the deeper implications of combining metal with swing, this album would still fit the Twins symbol quite well. Combining two radically different genres of any kind would make this album feel like it had a dual personality. Metal and swing just happen to make the duality a bit more obvious by conveying radically different emotions. If you're a Gemini and you like metal or any sort of weird combination of genres, check this out. Now for an album that fits Gemini's element. For those of you who don't know, there are 3 signs for each element, and the elements are earth, water, fire, and air. Gemini is an air sign. An album that reminds me of air is Depression Cherry by Beach House. When I think of air, I think light, calming, and atmospheric. When I think of light, calming, and atmospheric, I think of a few genres, namely post-rock, ambient, ethereal wave, and dream pop. I chose the latter because most ethereal wave is a bit too dark, and post-rock and ambient have a bunch of very long, drawn-out songs that probably wouldn't fit well with some of the negative traits of Gemini. Beach House's Depression Cherry has a few long songs, but the album is only 9 tracks long, meaning that it isn't too long of an album. Also, the album's instrumentation is so beautiful that I don't know how anyone could get bored. When listening to some of the songs on this album, I feel like I'm drifting away into the stratosphere. So I guess air is an appropriate thing to compare it to. Another reason this album fits the air element so well would be some of these song titles. Levitating and Bluebird in particular. These two songs are both love songs, which adds to the light, airy feel of this album. So far, I've been making this album sound more positive than the last one, but now it's time to talk about the other side. Aside from the 2 songs I just mentioned, and maybe 1 or 2 others, this album's lyrics are surprisingly sad. It has a bit of a dual nature, much like the last album. This album has tons of breakup songs, and I don't mean the angry kind either. I mean the sad kind, which, once again, reminds me of a Gemini going through tough times when paired with this relaxing instrumentation. I know I said this album was meant to find albums that fit the traits and symbols of Gemini, not their actual music taste, but I definitely recommend that any Geminis watching check this out. Mainly because I know you guys have a tendency to overthink things, and this album might calm your nerves. It certainly does mine. Next time you're feeling anxious, throw this one on. Up next is an album that fits Gemini's quality. For those of you who don't know, there are 4 signs for each quality, and the qualities are cardinal, fixed, and mutable. Gemini is a mutable sign, and an album that reminds me of mutable is Blurry Face by 21 Pilots. Twenty-One Pilots may be the most mutable band in history. They constantly switch genres, and vocalist Tyler Joseph can do a variety of vocal styles, including singing, rapping, and occasionally screaming. This album could have also worked for twins, considering it's an album about Tyler Joseph having 2 personalities. However, I decided to use it for mutable since the Diablo Swing Orchestra album doesn't really work for anything other than twins, and I really wanted to talk about that album. Anyway, to give you an idea of how mutable this album is, the first 3 songs on it are in the following genres: experimental hip-hop, rap rock, and reggae. That alone would be enough to justify this album being mutable, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Some songs on here, such as Lane Boy, switch genres mid-song. If that's not mutable, I don't know what is. I also think this album fits Gemini well because Geminis have a tendency to overthink things. Throughout this album, Tyler mentions that he's thinking too much. He also mentions that his overthinking is causing him a lot of pain. Again, it makes me think of a Gemini going through tough times. I know this album is for mutable and not twins, but since it also fits the twins aspect of Gemini, I want to talk about that too. On this album, Tyler talks about how he has 2 sides to his personality, with his insecure side being called Blurry Face. Again, this concept reminds me more than a little of the Diary of Anne Frank. I know I keep bringing this up, but Anne Frank is my favorite Gemini who isn't a family member, so whenever I think of many Gemini traits, I think of her. Anyway, this is another album that I think a lot of Geminis might actually like, mainly because of the dual nature described in the lyrics. If you're a Gemini who struggles with feeling like you're 2 people at once, this is the album for you. It may also be relatable to your struggles with overthinking. The next few albums will be about Gemini's personality traits. I got most of these traits from a website that will be linked in the description. This first trait is basically a synonym for mutable, but since it's Gemini's most notable trait, I couldn't leave it off. That first trait is adaptable, so another album that switches genres constantly is California by Mr. Bungle. Mr. Bungle is another extremely adaptable band. The main label they usually get assigned is experimental rock, which is accurate, but it doesn't even begin to tell the whole story. According to Wikipedia, this album alone contains elements of folk music from various countries, doo-wop, circus music, surf rock, psychobilly, heavy metal, and various others. Keep in mind that most people agree that this is Mr. Bungle's most accessible album. Remember when I said that 21 Pilots was the most mutable band ever? Yeah, after doing my research on Mr. Bungle, I may have to take that back. If you're wondering why I went with their most accessible album, it's because their other albums are kind of dark and abrasive, which does not make me think of Gemini. This album does have its darker moments, such as none of them knew they were robots, but overall it's a lot less abrasive. However, while the music may be lighter, the lyrics are still dark. Again, going back to the Anne Frank thing of being light on the outside and dark on the inside. This album touches on themes of disillusionment with society. In other words, the lyrics are about as depressing as you can get. Anyway, going back to the theme of adaptability, this album is similar to 21 Pilots in that it constantly switches genres and it does so effortlessly. Somehow it doesn't feel disjointed at all. Also, Mike Patton's voice is pretty versatile. It goes from deep to high-pitched, and it does so in a way that sounds great no matter how high or low he's singing. If you're a Gemini who wants to push your musical boundaries, check this one out. This album also uses a lot of big words, so you may enjoy using your Gemini brain to decode what they're saying. Or you may just want to have fun and listen to the music. It works for that purpose too. Now I know what you're thinking. Why are all these albums so depressing? Don't you listen to anything happy? Well, as it turns out, I do. And seeing as the next Gemini trait is outgoing, I think it's time to introduce you guys to an amazing party record called Voodooism by Sismix. When I think of outgoing, I think of parties. When I think of parties, I think of electronic music. This album in particular makes me think of a Halloween party. I'm sure plenty of Geminis would enjoy one of those. This album and the genre of house music in general always makes me think of a bunch of people dancing together. That's about as outgoing as you can get. It doesn't have the darkness underneath the surface like the previous albums, and any darkness it does have is goofy Halloween darkness. This album is pure happiness and it knows it. A lot of electronic music is either repetitive, overly long, or abrasive, none of which make me think of Gemini. House music, and especially the subgenre known as complextro that this album falls into, are exceptions to that. Each individual song is distinct, they're all relatively short, and the instrumentation is bright and happy. It's the perfect Gemini genre. It's also the perfect Gemini genre because of how energetic it is. There isn't a boring moment on this album. In other words, it should keep a Gemini's attention all the way through. Even the long song at the end called Souls of the Forest has enough energy and switch-ups to keep the audience invested. After all the depressing music I just subjected you guys to, I'm sure this album feels like a breath of fresh air. It's how Geminis are on the outside, bright and happy. If you're the kind of Gemini who's more happy and fun-loving, this is the album for you. After that brief bit of happiness, we go back to the darker music. The next Gemini trait is intelligent. When it comes to intelligent music, there's a lot to choose from. Experimental hip-hop, classical, IDM. But what I chose is Every Trick in the Book by Ice Nine Kills. Ice Nine Kills is one of the more intelligent metalcore bands out there. This album is a prime example of that. Each song on this album is about a different book, and while horror seems to be their favorite genre, they talk about books from a wide variety of different genres too. Some of the books included are Animal Farm by George Orwell, Carrie by Stephen King, Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare, and The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. It's also a fitting album because I read somewhere that while Gemini and Virgo are both intelligent because they're both ruled by Mercury, Virgo's intelligence is more math-oriented while Gemini's is more English-oriented. This makes me think that a lot of Geminis like to read, which means that a lot of them have probably read at least one of the books that Ice Nine Kills talk about on this album. If not, then congratulations! You guys just got some free book recommendations. This album is also more intelligent than most metalcore albums because it includes some symphonic elements, which shows that these guys know their genres. Also, classical music is stereotyped as the most intelligent genre. It's not just a stereotype, however. Studies have shown that classical fans and metal fans are both among the more intelligent types of music fans. So it's appropriate for that reason too. This album also strikes me as a Gemini album because it's a concept album. Concept albums are albums that either tell a story or have a specific theme, both of which fit the cerebral nature of Gemini. Since I already mentioned that Geminis like to read, a concept album about books sounds like it would be heaven to you guys. Especially since some of the books were written by Geminis, such as The Diary of Anne Frank. Okay, I'll stop bringing that up. Anyway, if you're new to metalcore, you should know that it's not exactly a Gemini genre. It's usually more emotional than intellectual. Ice Nine Kills is one of the exceptions. They also have an album about different horror movies in case anyone's interested. Now for the final positive Gemini trait. That trait is witty. When it comes to witty music, there's a lot of bands that come to mind. Mostly in the pop-punk genre, but I'm not going to choose any of those. Instead, I'm going to choose Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables by the Dead Kennedys. The Dead Kennedys are one of the most beautifully sarcastic bands I've ever heard. They're a hardcore punk band from the 1980s, and this album is actually considered by many to be the birth of hardcore. They're also an extremely political band, and the way they talk about these issues is hilarious. A lot of these songs are basically satire, and many of them feel like what would happen if Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal was made into a punk song. Some of my favorite examples of this include Kill the Poor, a song written from the point of view of a bunch of rich people who want to drop an atom bomb on the poor, and Let's Lynch the Landlord, which is about exactly what the title says it's about. The most famous song on here is Holiday in Cambodia, a song which is making fun of vapid rich people who think they're woke by suggesting that they take a holiday in Cambodia, which at the time was controlled by a brutal dictator named Pol Pot. All of these songs are hilarious and never fail to put a twisted smile on my face. Some of my favorite lines from these songs include, "Convince the liberals it's okay, all systems go and kill the poor tonight," and "It's a holiday in Cambodia where the slums got so much soul." Some of the songs on this album could also work for mutable or adaptable. For example, the song Chemical Warfare starts out like a pretty typical punk song, but then there's a waltz section thrown in, and the song When You Get Drafted has a part that sounds like it's from a spy movie soundtrack. Also, this album is somewhat mutable in the sense that it's basically a transition between hardcore punk and more typical punk rock. Because of this, the album contains songs that sound like both. On the punk side of things, there's songs like Kill the Poor, Holiday in Cambodia, and Let's Lynch the Landlord. On the hardcore side, there's songs like Drug Me, Stealing People's Mail, and When You Get Drafted. Both sides sound good, and the album flows well. Again, pretty mutable. A lot of hardcore punk is a bit too aggressive to remind me much of Gemini, but this album is an exception. It's a lighter hardcore album. Well, relatively speaking at least. It's just bouncy enough to fit Gemini. If you're a Gemini who happens to be into left-wing politics, check this album out. Now we start with the negative Gemini traits. If you can't take criticism, I'd recommend clicking off this video now. If you can, stick around because the first negative Gemini trait is indecisive. An album that fits this trait is Fruit by Marina. I told you I liked some happy music. In fact, the album right after this one is going to be happy as well. This album has a few darker songs, but overall it's pretty happy. You're welcome. So, interesting story as to how I found this one. I was browsing a Tumblr blog about astrology, and I found a post comparing the 12 songs on this album to the 12 zodiac signs. You could say that this album fits every sign, but I think it fits Gemini better overall for a few reasons. One is that many of these songs are indecisive. For example, the song Blue is about a woman who's torn between wanting this guy and knowing he's not good for her. I'm a Ruin is pretty much the same, but with the roles reversed. The song that the Tumblr post assigned to Gemini was the title track, Fruit, which shows Gemini's more fun-loving side. It's not really indecisive, but it still fits Gemini well. There are songs that fit Gemini quite well for other reasons, too. I already mentioned Fruit, but there's also the highly intelligent song Savages, and the song Can't Pin Me Down, which fits most air signs, come to think of it. It's about not wanting to be tied down to one partner, which I'm sure a lot of Geminis can relate to. Before any of you take this the wrong way, no, I'm not calling you guys cheaters. I'm just saying that a lot of you are afraid of commitment. Another thing that makes me think of Gemini when it comes to this album is the inconsistent tone. Yeah, this album jumps from topic to topic a lot, even by non-concept album standards. However, all of the songs are so interesting that I hardly care. In fact, this is another album that represents the fun side of Gemini perfectly. Anyway, remember when I mentioned that the next album is going to be happy too? Well, here goes. The next trait is Impulsive. A good album for Impulsive is Redline by Laserhawk. things come to mind when I think of impulsivity. One of them is flying down the highway in a fast car, which is what this album by synthwave producer Laserhawk makes me think of. For those of you who don't know, a red line is a line seen on a car's speedometer, particularly the red line. Basically, this is a driving album. In fact, synthwave is full of albums that fit the description I just gave. Synthwave as a genre is partially inspired by the retro-futuristic 80s aesthetic of fast cars, which means that it has a lot of driving albums. All of these would have made great Gemini albums, but I decided to go with the first one I ever heard. By the way, Blinding Lights by The Weeknd is a synthwave song, so if you like that song, as I know most of my audience does, check out this album. Anyway, back to how this fits Gemini. Like the last album, this album is a lot of fun. In addition to great driving music, these songs also make great party music. Parties are another thing that come to mind when I think of outgoing. The fact that this album is so much fun makes it a great Gemini album in of itself. Songs like Dream Machine, Overdrive, and Electric Groove are all great songs to dance to. All of these songs are great songs to blast while in the car with friends. It's just a fun album. By the way, remember when I said that most electronic music was too abrasive or too long and repetitive for a Gemini to enjoy and house music was the exception? Yeah, synthwave is another exception. It's got songs that stand out from each other and lots of bright, happy instrumentation. Well, except for the genre known as dark synth, I guess. Anyway, we're down to the last album, and the final negative trait is nosy. I couldn't find a ton of albums to fit this quality, to be honest. The closest I could find were some political albums about uncovering government secrets. And the one of those I chose to use is Tyranny by Shadow Gallery.
Down in anger, blood into the handle. Machines of mass destruction. Well, I helped you design them. The guilt of children bloodstains on my hand. No word from the boardroom. The boys in Tehran have scored.
And Room 5 by Shadow Gallery. That's right, I'm giving you guys 2 albums for the price of 1 for our grand finale. Aren't I nice? Anyway, like I said, these are both political albums. They touch on themes of war and the military-industrial complex. If you're wondering why I'm including both of these albums, it's because they're both concept albums. Room 5 is a sequel to Tyranny, and it's impossible to get the full picture without hearing both of them. I won't spoil too much, but basically, these albums are about a guy who uncovers the government's evil schemes and does his best to stop them. If you're wondering why this fits Gemini, it's because Geminis are known for being curious, if a little nosy, and prying into the government's secrets sounds like just the sort of thing they would do. It also reminds me of Gemini because, again, these are intelligent albums. Not only are they concept albums, they have all sorts of political implications and themes that people will probably not get unless they're a political junkie. If you're not a political junkie, though, don't worry, the story is still cool even without knowing the background. Even if you're not into lyrics, these albums are wonderfully complex. The instrumentation is filled with instrumental switch-ups, tempo changes, and odd time signatures. Even the instrumentation is intelligent. If that doesn't scream Gemini, I don't know what does. Just to warn you guys, a lot of the songs on these albums are pretty long. The closing track, Rain, from Room 5, is nearly 9 minutes long. So if you have a short attention span, avoid these. However, if you can sit through a book, you can probably sit through these. The lyrics pretty much read like a book anyway. And that's my list. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. I'm Morgan the Rebellious Reviewer, and I'm out. Kyra, shut up! That'll be a blooper. Anyway. Rio, you should have done it before we started. Because now Kyra's gonna mess up all my takes. Kyra, he's in there. Kyra, please, I'm trying to film. Rio, you've caused a blooper. It's a better blooper than what you would have caused, but you've still caused a blooper. Blooper, blooper. Kyra, you're causing a giant blooper. Seriously. Thank you for letting me get through that sentence, Kyra. Kyra!